The courtroom was suffocating in its silence, a heavy, expectant hush blanketing the air. The only sound was the rhythmic, almost deliberate tapping of Judge Malcolm Foster's gavel against the wooden bench, a slow, calculated beat that echoed like a war drum. His presence alone commanded obedience, his ironclad reputation preceding him. To many, he was a legend. To those who stood before him, he was something far worse. Defendants feared him, prosecutors envied his control, and in the whispered corners of the legal world, his name carried a weight both revered and despised. He was not merely a judge. He was a force, an arbiter who wielded power with an authority that often blurred the line between justice and tyranny. Today, at the defense table sat Karoline Leavitt, young, ambitious, and already a name that sent ripples through the establishment. She had made a career of unearthing corruption, pulling skeletons from closets no one dared touch. She had faced powerful men before, men who thought themselves untouchable, and she had beaten them. But today, she was up against a different beast. Today, her opponent wasn't just another corrupt official. He was the system itself, embodied in the towering figure of Judge Malcolm Foster. Her posture was composed, her fingers laced together atop the polished mahogany table. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, armed with facts, legal precedents, and an unwavering resolve that had seen her through battles many had deemed impossible. But something about the way Foster was looking at her, calculating, almost amused, sent a prickle of warning down her spine. Judge Malcolm Foster leaned forward, his graying eyebrows arching over piercing, predatory eyes that glimmered with condescension. Judge Malcolm Foster. Well, Miss Leavitt, I must say it's amusing that someone with your limited experience would dare take on a case of this magnitude. A ripple of laughter skittered through the room, not from the audience, but from a carefully chosen group. His loyalists, the prosecutors who had prospered under his rule, the clerks who turned a blind eye to his dealings, and even a few jury members, their smirks barely concealed. It was an orchestrated performance, a show of dominance designed to unnerve her. Karoline didn't flinch, didn't even shift in her seat. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression impassive, her silence a weapon of its own. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, unwavering. Karoline Leavitt. With all due respect, Your Honor, the law doesn't measure experience in years. It measures it in truth. The laughter faded. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who had smirked moments ago seemed to sense something shift in the air. Foster's smirk thinned, his fingers tightening ever so slightly around the gavel. He did not appreciate being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. He enjoyed breaking ambitious attorneys. He relished watching their confidence wither under his scrutiny. And today, he had every intention of breaking Karoline Leavitt. Judge Malcolm Foster Truth? He let the word linger, his voice laced with mockery. That's a big word for someone arguing a case built on baseless accusations. He turned slightly, his gaze settling on the prosecutor seated across from Karoline. A longtime ally, a man who owed much of his career to the very judge now granting him a silent nod. It was a signal, subtle but clear. Now was the time to press forward, to remind this idealistic young woman exactly how things worked in Malcolm Foster's courtroom. The prosecutor smirked, his fingers leisurely flipping through the stack of neatly organized documents before him. He took his time, reveling in the moment, before finally speaking, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who knew the game was already won before it had even begun. The courtroom remained thick with tension, the air charged with an energy that threatened to suffocate those within its walls. The faint rustle of papers, the occasional cough, and the tapping of a restless foot were the only sounds that broke the stifling silence. Prosecutor Daniel Reeves. Of course, Your Honor. Falsely accusing a standing judge can result in immediate dismissal, sanctions, and if deemed egregious, disbarment. A hushed murmur rippled through the room. That was the warning shot. The thinly veiled threat meant to deter Karoline Leavitt from stepping any further into the fire. If she dared push forward, she wouldn't just lose her case. She could lose everything she had worked for. But Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements, her every action designed to command attention. She pulled out a thick manila folder, its edges slightly worn from the number of times she had pored over its contents. With unwavering resolve, she placed it on the table and slid it toward the bailiff. Karoline Leavitt. In that case, I request this evidence be entered into the record. A pause. The bailiff hesitated, his eyes darting toward Judge Foster as if silently asking for permission. The judge's jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he signaled for the bailiff to proceed. The clerk, a young man with sharp eyes, flipped through the pages, his face paling with each turn. The quiet room became even quieter, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on those present. Because in Karoline Leavitt's hands was something no one had expected. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. And within minutes, Judge Malcolm Foster's world would come crashing down. The unraveling begins. The momentary flicker of panic in Judge Foster's eyes was almost imperceptible, but Karoline caught it. She saw the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly inward. For a man who had spent years cultivating an image of unshakable authority, it was a telltale crack in his carefully constructed facade. Judge Malcolm Foster. This court will take a brief recess. A recess. A desperate attempt to stall, to regain control. Karoline knew it, and so did the murmuring crowd. But before anyone could challenge the abrupt decision, Foster slammed his gavel down with finality, sending an unmistakable message. He still controlled the room. The jury members were ushered out, their faces reflecting varying degrees of confusion and curiosity. The spectators whispered amongst themselves, their voices a hushed undercurrent of speculation. The air crackled with an unspoken anticipation. As Karoline watched the scene unfold, her gaze locked onto Prosecutor Daniel Reeves. He was leaning forward, speaking in hushed but hurried tones into his phone. Damage control. That's what this was. If Foster had skeletons in his closet, Reeves was the one holding the key to the door. A low voice cut through Karoline's thoughts. Eleanor. Marsh, you should be careful, Miss Leavitt. Karoline turned to see Eleanor Marsh, the seasoned court reporter who had spent over 2 decades chronicling the rise and fall of powerful men. If there was anyone who knew the inner workings of this courthouse, it was her, Karoline Leavitt. I know what I'm doing, Miss Marsh. Eleanor Marsh, I hope so. Because if you're wrong, you won't just lose your case. You'll lose everything. Karoline didn't need the warning. She was already well aware of what was at stake. But she had come too far to back down now. The truth was on her side, and she would see this through to the end. 15 minutes later, the doors swung open and Judge Foster returned, his expression unreadable. He ascended the bench with the same practiced authority he always carried. But Karoline could see it now, the slight rigidity in his shoulders, the calculated way he avoided looking directly at her. He tapped his gavel twice. Judge Malcolm Foster Court is back in session. Then, folding his hands in front of him, he smiled, not a genuine smile, a practiced, predatory one. The game was far from over. Judge Malcolm Foster's reckoning, Judge Malcolm Foster. Now, Miss Leavitt, before we proceed, I must inform you that your evidence has been reviewed and deemed inadmissible. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Karoline's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Karoline Leavitt, on what grounds? Judge Malcolm Foster. The chain of custody is unclear. Furthermore, some of these documents appear to have been obtained unethically. He paused, savoring the moment before delivering his final blow. Judge Malcolm Foster. As such, I am recommending an investigation into your legal conduct, Miss Leavitt. If found guilty of malpractice, you may be disbarred. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Karoline had anticipated resistance, but this was outright sabotage. Foster was playing dirty, using his unchecked power to crush her before she could expose him. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Malcolm Foster sat smugly on his bench, confident that he had successfully crushed Karoline Leavitt's case. But behind her calm facade, Karoline's mind was racing. She knew this was a setup, a blatant abuse of power. She took a deep breath, standing tall as she faced the judge. Karoline Leavitt. With all due respect, Your Honor, dismissing key evidence without proper review is an obstruction of justice. Judge Malcolm Foster, I am the law in this courtroom, Miss Leavitt. You'd do well to remember that. But Karoline wasn't intimidated. She had one last move to play, one that would shake Foster's confidence to its core. Judge Malcolm Foster leaned forward, his lips curling into a knowing smirk.
He thought he had won, Judge Malcolm Foster. You may want to reconsider your tone, Miss Leavitt. You're dangerously close to contempt. Karoline took a deep breath. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew something the judge
didn't. His house of cards was about to collapse. The weight of Judge Foster's corruption loomed over the courtroom like a dark cloud. Karoline had anticipated resistance, but now, faced with the possibility of being disbarred, she knew she had to act fast. As the court resumed, Karoline did something unexpected. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. Instead, she leaned forward, meeting Judge Foster's smug gaze with an eerie calmness. Karoline Leavitt. Your Honor, before we proceed further, I'd like to make a request. Judge Foster raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Judge Malcolm Foster. A request? I assumed you were prepared to defend yourself. Karoline smiled slightly. Karoline Leavitt. Oh, I will. But first, I believe we should invite a guest into the courtroom. She turned to the doors, nodding at the bailiff. A moment later, they swung open, and in walked Special Agent Marcus Dean from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Foster's face lost its color for a brief second. Marcus Dean. Your Honor, I'm here on behalf of the U.S. Attorney's Office. We've recently uncovered some interesting financial transactions linked to your personal accounts. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Foster's fingers tightened around his gavel. Judge Malcolm Foster. This is outrageous. You have no authority here. Agent Dean calmly produced a folder and handed it to the prosecutor. Marcus Dean. We have bank statements, offshore accounts, and testimonies from individuals willing to testify against you, Your Honor. This case is now much bigger than Miss Leavitt's. For the first time, Judge Foster had no words. The walls were closing in and Karoline could see it in his eyes. He knew he was finished. The courtroom was no longer Judge Malcolm Foster's domain. It was a battlefield. The once untouchable judge now found himself grasping at control as Karoline Leavitt methodically dismantled his defenses. Karoline Leavitt. Your Honor, let's discuss the offshore accounts tied to your personal bank records. Judge Foster's gavel slammed down hard. His face was flushed, his mask of authority slipping. Judge Malcolm Foster, this is irrelevant. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to slander the court. Karoline Leavitt. Then you won't mind if we play an audio recording? Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karoline pressed play on a small recorder. The room filled with the unmistakable voice of Judge Foster. Judge Malcolm Foster's reckoning. Judge Malcolm Foster, recording. If Leavitt keeps pushing, she'll never practice law again. Make sure the evidence disappears. Silence. The weight of those words crushed any last vestiges of doubt. Judge Foster had been caught, on tape, in front of everyone. The bailiff took an uncertain step forward, waiting for an order. The tension was unbearable. Karoline leaned in, locking eyes with the judge. Karoline Leavitt. You no longer control this courtroom, Your Honor. Judge Foster's hands trembled. The power had shifted. And now, justice was closing in. The courtroom had transformed into a battleground where Judge Malcolm Foster's authority crumbled with each revelation. His arrogance was now replaced with a nervous energy that betrayed his fear. Karoline Leavitt, Your Honor, can you explain why funds from a known defense contractor mysteriously appeared in your personal accounts? Judge Foster's fingers curled into fists. His once commanding voice wavered. Judge Malcolm Foster. This is an outrage? You have no jurisdiction to question me? Karoline Leavitt. Oh, but I do. And so does the federal investigation that was launched an hour ago. Murmurs erupted across the courtroom. The judge had been outmaneuvered. The walls were closing in. For the first time in his career, Judge Malcolm Foster was no longer the one delivering the verdict. He was the one on trial. The moment had arrived. The once invincible Judge Malcolm Foster now sat slumped in his chair, the weight of the courtroom pressing against him. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, her voice unwavering as she delivered the final blow. Karoline Leavitt. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce one final piece of evidence, testimony from a federal investigator. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A tall man in a dark suit entered. Special Agent Thomas Greer stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the lights. Special Agent Thomas Greer. Judge Malcolm Foster, you are under federal investigation for corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The judge's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could utter a word, Bailiff, sir, I need you to stand. Handcuffs clicked around Judge Foster's wrists. The once mighty ruler of the courtroom was now a prisoner of his own corruption. The entire courtroom erupted. Some whispered in disbelief. Others smirked, knowing justice had finally prevailed. Karoline Leavitt watched as Foster was led away, his legacy shattered. She had done what many thought impossible. She had brought down a tyrant, and as the doors swung shut behind the disgraced judge, she exhaled. Justice had been served. With Judge Malcolm Foster disgraced and in custody, the courtroom finally exhaled. Karoline Leavitt stood at the center of it all, the weight of her victory settling in. The headlines the next morning told the world, corrupt judge brought to justice by fearless attorney. The system had long shielded men like Foster, but today, that shield had cracked. Karoline walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, knowing this was just the beginning. There were more battles ahead, but today, justice had won, and that was enough. As Karoline Leavitt walked out of the courthouse, a cool breeze brushed against her face. The weight of the trial, the tension, the fear, it all melted away, replaced by a profound sense of triumph. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. She paused at the courthouse steps, looking back at the grand doors that had housed years of corruption. Today, they had seen something different, a reckoning. Judge Malcolm Foster was no longer untouchable. He was just another criminal brought to justice. A group of young law students stood nearby, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them, a young woman with a notepad clutched tightly in her hands, stepped forward hesitantly. Young student, Miss Leavitt, what you did today. It was incredible. How did you stay so fearless? Karoline smiled, though there was a weight behind it. Karoline Leavitt, fear is natural, but letting it control you? That's a choice. The student nodded, scribbling down notes. As Karoline turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another case, another battle. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about one victory. It was about never backing down. Stories like this remind us of the power of truth and resilience. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to subscribe for more compelling narratives. Don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think.